How do you feel when you hear Jesus say, "Do not worry"? If you're someone who struggles on occasion with worry or anxiety, hearing Jesus say that not once, not twice, not three times, but four times in today's reading might not be the most relaxing thing that you could hear. And you might be thinking, oh, great, now I'm worrying about the fact that I worry. And while you wish you weren't so familiar with that sort of tightening of the chest or the butterflies in your stomach, the dry mouth and the difficulty swallowing, that strange combination of both having loads of nervous energy but also being exhausted by your worries. You might think, I don't want that, but Jesus, I'm not sure just telling me not to worry is that helpful. Well, maybe, but as we slow down this morning, as we listen, as we meditate on Jesus' words, we're going to discover that actually he really gets it. He understands what life is like for us, what life in our world is like. But he doesn't just know the problem, he knows the solution as well. He knows what will help us. We see he understands from the very end of the reading. Have a look at that last verse 34. Jesus says, "Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Each day has enough trouble of its own. You see, Jesus, he gets it. He knows there are lots of things that are very sensible for us to be concerned about. Every day there are enough troubles for that day. And that's before you start thinking about the bigger picture. Jesus, he gets it. He knows what life in a fallen world is like. And he also knows something we're probably all familiar with, that although worry is very natural for us, it doesn't work. Verse 27 in the middle of the reading, what does he say? "Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" And if we've ever been gripped by worry and experienced how little it achieves, well, we'll know the answer to Jesus' question is, of course, no. We can't, by worrying, add a single hour to our life. As Corrie ten Boom, the lady who helped shield a lot of Jewish people in the Holocaust, said, "Worry does not empty tomorrow of its sorrow. Rather, worry empties today of its strength. Worry does not empty tomorrow of its sorrow. Rather, it empties today of its strength." And I wonder if that's one of the things that makes worrying so exhausting, that ultimately we know it won't make a difference. And so when Jesus says, "Do not worry," he knows what we're like. He knows who he's speaking to. He gets that there's plenty of things for us to be concerned about. And yet he also understands that being consumed by that concern will not help us. And so he can help. He can help. He doesn't just understand. He knows the help that we need. And he knows how to help us in a way that our worries and our anxieties, they don't challenge our faith. They don't threaten to overwhelm our faith, but rather he shows us how our worries and our anxieties can be an opportunity to grow in our faith. And so that's what we're going to think about this morning. But before we sort of dive in to the help Jesus has to offer, we just need to pin down one more thing, do one more bit of groundwork, which is to understand, to work out what Jesus means when he speaks about worry in these verses. The Greek word that we have translated worried, it sort of has the sense of having a distracted mind, or maybe being double-minded, having a foot in two camps, having divided loyalties. And if you've been with us as we've been working through the Sermon on the Mount, you probably have an inkling of the sort of divided loyalties that Jesus is speaking to. Indeed, you might have noticed in verse 25, the reading, it starts with the word therefore. It's Jesus' way of tying it back to what he said in the previous section when we were thinking last week, weren't we, about where do we keep our treasures? Do we store up treasures on earth or treasures in heaven? Where are our loyalties? Where's our mind? And then in verse 33 of today's reading, he says, seek first his kingdom, God's kingdom, his righteousness, God's righteousness. And then all these things, all the other things you're concerned about, will be given to you as well. As Jesus speaks of this sort of double-minded, split loyalty worry, he says we have a choice. Our primary concern, it's either God's kingdom or our kingdom. And he says one priority leads to God's provision, and the other priority leads to our anxiety. And so he says, where's your primary concern? God's kingdom or your kingdom? And of course, he wants our primary concern, as he says in verse 33, to be God's kingdom. That's not to say, if our primary concern is God's kingdom, that we should be unconcerned about the things of this world. Rather, we just shouldn't be over-concerned with them. Or maybe to put that a slightly different way, the worry Jesus speaks about here, it's not the same as having reasonable, legitimate concern. So if you're, if you're teaching your child to swim, it's right that you're concerned for them, because as they jump into the water, they have no concern for themselves and the fact that they might drown. It's right that you're there to grab them, to be on hand. Or maybe a new colleague has joined your team at work and they're completely new to your industry. It's right that you're concerned for them and you help them understand how things are different in this industry to their previous line of work. Or if you're taking a course at university that you're struggling to get your head around, it's right that you're concerned and you go and speak to the lecturer about it. You see, the sort of worry that Jesus is speaking about here, it's not a... he's not speaking against having an appropriate concern for the troubles of today. He just doesn't want us to be over-concerned, overburdened by them. And that being overburdened is what he wants to help us with today. So let's see the help he has to offer us. Let's dive in. Verse 25. Jesus says, therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? We have well-stocked supermarkets on every street corner, don't we? And we have clothes shops that will deliver to our door the very next day. And so we probably worry a little bit less about food and clothing than the people of Jesus' day. But I wonder, can you see what he's saying? Jesus says to them, if God has given you life, if God has given you this really big thing, do you not think he will give you the food you need to sustain that life, a much smaller thing? Or if God has given you a body, an amazing body that can do all sorts of things, do you not also think he'll do the smaller thing of giving you the clothes that you need to protect that body. It's a bit like a child being really worried about their birthday party, and they're fixated on the fact that you might not have invited all their friends. And so the mum or the dad says to that child, don't worry, I've booked the venue, I've arranged the activities, I've sorted the entertainer, I've baked you the cake, I've got the balloons ready, I've wrapped the presents, I've done all these things. Of course, I've made sure your friends know it's happening. I've done the really big stuff. I'm not going to forget the little things. And Jesus says that's what God is like. He says, I've done the big things for you. You don't need to worry about the small things. And then Jesus gives us some examples, and just to keep us on our toes, having just told us that God gives us the big stuff, so we don't need to worry about the little things. His examples work the other way round. And he says, listen, God cares about the small things. And so, of course, he's going to care about the big things. God cares about the birds and the flowers. As we saw in Psalm 104, we had that amazing list of the ways that God cares for his creation. And God says, if I'm going to care for these little things, of course I'm going to care for you. Things that are much more precious. Have a look, see how Jesus puts it in verse 26 of Matthew 6. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Jesus says, look out the window and notice the birds. Now the birds, they're not over concerned about where their food is going to come from. They're not busy sowing or reaping or storing away in barns, which I guess are all the things that you would do if you were worried about where your food was going to come from. Look at the birds and see how, what does he say? How your heavenly Father feeds them. Not their heavenly Father, your heavenly Father. And so how much more will your heavenly Father provide for you, who he values so much more than the birds? He provides for the birds of the air. Of course he'll provide for you, Jesus says to us. In passing, note that Jesus' answer to being over-concerned is not being completely unconcerned. He's not sort of telling us to chill out to the point where we're indifferent or apathetic, because it's not as if God providing for the birds means that they don't have to do anything. The food doesn't sort of miraculously drop into their beaks from the sky. They still have to go into the trees and the hedgerows to find the food God has provided. So it's not that Jesus says be completely unconcerned, but rather have an appropriate level of concern, that both trusts your heavenly Father to provide what you need and then goes to seek out that provision. Then he gives another example, verse 28. Why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow, yet they do not labour or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon, in all his splendour, was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Look out the window again, Jesus says. But this time, don't look up at the birds of the air. Look down at the grass of the field. And notice how the grass isn't over concerned about where its clothing is going to come from. They're not busy labouring or spinning, not doing the things that they would be doing if they were over concerned. And yet, what does Jesus say? God dresses them more splendidly than Solomon, more splendidly than the sort of high point of Israel's kings. And he does that even though the grass is passing, even though it will be splendid in bloom today and fuel for the fire the next. And you are not that. You're not here today, gone tomorrow. You are precious, eternal creatures. And so don't doubt, Jesus says, that God will provide for you. Jesus, he says to his followers, he says to us, you're more valuable than the birds of the air whom your heavenly Father feeds, and you're more lasting than the grass of the field which God clothes. And so please don't worry. You can trust him to provide for you. Now, let me pause at this point. Let me take an aside, because some of us may be thinking, well, what about those Christians we were praying for just a moment ago? Those Christians around the world who actually don't have what they need. How do we think about them? And more importantly, how do we think about Jesus' words? Can they stand up to scrutiny when confronted with the reality of Christians in need? Well, here's what I think. I think, ironically, it's the worry of Christians who have plenty, who are able to store up things in barns in case that really rainy day comes. It's the worry of us with plenty that causes problems for those with little. You see, what have we seen? We've seen God invites us to be his means of provision, hasn't he? He spoke in the beginning of chapter 6 about how we can give to the needy. And God gives us what we need to do that. And yet, so often we use the excess he gives us to serve others, to feather our own nests and to make ourselves more comfortable. And we don't take up the invitation Jesus holds out to us. It's particularly clear later in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew 25, where Jesus says this. He says, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was ill and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. And he goes on. Then the righteous, that is, my followers, Jesus says, the righteous will answer me, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothing and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and go visit you? And Jesus says, the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Jesus, he invites us to give to him, to be his means of provision to his people. And yet when the wealthy, when we hoard things, we miss that opportunity to be caught up in what God is doing in the world. And we fail our brothers and our sisters. You see, if we find Jesus' words hard to square with our experience of the world, it's not necessarily his words that are the problem, and it might be you and me. Okay, aside over, let's come back to the big idea of this passage, the big thing Jesus wants us to take home today, as we pick things up in verse 31 of Matthew chapter 6. Jesus says, "So do not worry, saying, 'What shall we eat?' or 'What shall we drink?' or 'What shall we wear?' For the pagans run after these things. And your heavenly Father knows that you need them." Your Father in heaven knows what you need, and he's given you the big stuff. So of course, he's going to give you the little things. You don't need to run after them, to be overly concerned by them like the rest of the world does, because you have a heavenly Father who loves to provide. He provides for the birds and the grass. Things that he says don't matter to him as much as we do. And so, of course, we can trust him to provide for us. And if you ever find yourself struggling to believe that's true, do you know what you can do? You can look to God's biggest provision for us. You can look to the cross. And here's how Paul puts it in Romans chapter 8. Paul writes, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. He who gave the biggest thing he could to meet our needs. How will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things?" You see, Paul writes, if God was willing to send his son, Jesus Christ, to die for us, if he was willing to send Jesus to face the consequence of our sin, that we might stand innocent before God, if he was willing to send Jesus to defeat the power that death holds over us, to wash away our shame and clothe us with honor, to free us from hell, that we might enjoy forever with him in heaven, to bring us in, to adopt us in to his family so that we're no longer spiritual orphans. If God was willing to give up his own son that he might meet our greatest needs, what does Paul say? Well, will he not also provide for our other smaller needs? And so Jesus says, do not worry. And he says that not to burden us, but to free us. He knows what life in our fallen world is like. He knows that each day has enough troubles of its own. But he also knows that the sort of over-concern that we're prone to doesn't help us. And so he wants to set us free from that. And so, I don't know, here's something you could do on your way home in the glorious sunshine. You could sort of take on board what Jesus has said here, and you could look back with thankfulness on all the good things God has given you. Celebrate your life, your body that's walking you along the road. And as you reflect with thankfulness on all that God has given you, you can allow that past provision to grow your trust for what you need in the future. And you can, as you do that, you can pray with gratitude that he might continue to provide your needs as he's done in the past. And then as you walk along and you're in the bus or you're driving in the car, have a look around and notice your Heavenly Father's gracious provision. Look at the trees, look at the grass, see the birds, and then think, I'm more precious in my Heavenly Father's sight than these things are more lasting than the leaves that are falling off the trees in their beautiful colours. And if God has provided for them, well, surely he'll provide for me. And then you might want to think, how is it that I can be tempted to run after the things I need? How is it that I can be tempted not to trust, but actually I find myself being over concerned? And then maybe to pray, Lord, would you free me from that? Would you help me to trust your provision? And actually, Lord, you free me from worrying about the things of this world. Would you make my primary concern your kingdom and not my own? And then if you need more encouragement, cast your mind back to the cross where actually you're brought from the kingdom of darkness into his kingdom of light. Look back to the cross where your greatest needs were met. And allow that to still your worries that God won't provide. Allow the cross to draw you in to the freedom that Jesus wants us all to enjoy. And in fact, we're going to do that right now. We're going to look to the cross and remind ourselves of all that it's won for us as we sing again. I'm going to invite the band to come up and we're going to sing a song called His Mercy is More. And one of the things this song does, it like the facets on a diamond, it shows us lots of different angles of what God's mercy shown to us on the cross has done for us. Some of the different things that Jesus' death has won for us. And we're going to allow that to shape our hearts and guide our thoughts to all that God has given us. And then after that, we'll share the Lord's Supper together. But first, we're going to stand and we'll sing this song.